Working overnight at a diner isn't as chaotic as people imagine. Most of the time, it's the opposite. The busy part of the night ends sometime around midnight. After that, the place settles into a rhythm that gets pretty predictable. A few regulars might stop in for coffee, maybe someone coming off a late shift grabs a plate of food, but the rush is usually long gone. I'd been working nights at that diner in Albany for almost a year when this happened. By that point, I knew the routine almost down to the minute. The dishwasher humming in the back, the fluorescent lights buzzing slightly over the counter, the soft clink of plates when you stack them after wiping down the tables. Even when the diner was empty, there was always a small layer of background noise that made the place feel normal. That particular night in February of 2023 had been slow, even by overnight standards. A snowstorm earlier in the evening had kept most people off the roads, and by the time we reached the early morning hours, the streets outside were completely quiet. Around 1:30 a.m., the last customer paid his bill and left. The cook was still in the kitchen finishing some prep work for the morning shift, and I started going through the usual cleaning routine in the dining area. Wipe down the tables, refill the napkin holders, sweep around the booths. The front windows looked out onto an empty street with snow piled along the curb. The only light outside came from a street lamp across the road. Inside, the diner felt calm. By 2 o'clock, we normally lock the front door for about 30 minutes so we can finish cleaning without customers walking in. At exactly 2 a.m., I walked over to the entrance and turned the lock. The metal latch clicked loudly in the quiet room. I remember checking it twice out of habit. Locked. Then I turned the sign to closed for cleaning. After that, I went back behind the counter to start refilling the sugar dispensers. The cook in the back had the radio on low, and the sound of a talk show drifted faintly through the kitchen doorway. Everything felt exactly like it did every other night. That's why the sound stood out so clearly when it happened. A chair scraped across the floor. It wasn't loud, just a quick, sharp drag of metal legs against tile, the kind of sound a customer makes when they pull a chair out from under a table. I stopped what I was doing immediately. For a second, I thought maybe the cook had come out from the kitchen and sat down in one of the booths. But when I looked toward the doorway, he wasn't there. The kitchen light was still on, and I could hear him moving around back there. The sound had come from the dining area. I stepped around the counter slowly and looked across the room. At first, I didn't see anyone. The booths along the windows were empty. The small tables near the door were exactly where I'd left them. Then I noticed the booth near the far wall. Someone was sitting there. A man. He was already seated, leaning slightly forward with his hands resting on the table, and he was looking directly at me. For a moment, my brain didn't catch up with what I was seeing. I had just locked the front door. There had been no sound of it opening. No bell from the handle. No footsteps. But the man was sitting there like he had been there for a while. I stayed where I was near the counter. "Sorry," I said automatically. "We're closed for cleaning right now." The man didn't answer right away. He kept looking at me with a strange kind of calm expression. Not angry, not smiling, just watching. Then he spoke. "Can I get a coffee?" His voice was quiet but clear. I felt a small knot of confusion forming in my chest. "How did you get in here?" I asked. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he repeated the same question. "Just coffee." I glanced quickly at the front door. The lock was still turned. The sign still faced outward. There was no way he could have come in without me hearing it. For a second, I wondered if he had been in the bathroom when I locked up. But the diner bathrooms are right next to the counter. If someone walked out of them, I would have seen it immediately. The man stayed seated in the booth, waiting. Behind me, the cook called out from the kitchen. "Everything good out there?" I hesitated before answering. "Yeah," I said. "Just someone who came in late." I stepped back behind the counter and poured a cup of coffee. When I brought it over to the booth, the man watched me the entire time. Up close, he looked like he was in his late 30s or early 40s. Dark jacket, unshaven face. He didn't look drunk or disoriented, just quiet. I set the coffee cup on the table. "That'll be $2, I said. He nodded but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he took a slow sip of the coffee and looked around the diner. "You here all night?" he asked. "Until 6, I said. He nodded again. Then he went back to staring into the cup. Something about the situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I walked back behind the counter and stood there pretending to organize receipts while watching him from across the room. The diner had 12 booths and 6 small tables. Every seat was empty, except for the one he occupied. After a minute, I walked to the front door and checked the lock again. Still locked. I turned slightly so I could see the hallway leading to the bathrooms. Both doors were open. The lights inside were off. There was nowhere in the diner someone could hide without being noticed, but the man was still there. After a few minutes, he finished the coffee and slid the cup toward the edge of the table. Then he stood up. "I'll head out," he said. He walked toward the front door. I followed a few steps behind him. He reached the handle and pulled. The door didn't move. Then he turned back toward me. "You locked it," he said. "Yeah," I replied. I stepped past him and unlocked the door. Cold air rushed in from outside when I opened it. The man walked out without another word. I watched him cross the snowy sidewalk and disappear down the street. For a long moment, I stood there with the door open. Then I locked it again. When I turned around, the cook was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at me. "Who was that?" he asked. "Customer," I said. He frowned. "When did he come in?" I hesitated. "That's the thing," I said. "I'm not sure." We both checked the bathrooms. Empty. We checked the back hallway and storage room. Nothing. There was nowhere else in the diner someone could have been hiding. Later that morning, when the manager arrived, I told her what happened. She pulled up the security camera footage from the front door. We watched it together in the office. The recording showed me locking the door at 2 a.m. Then the dining room stayed empty for several minutes, until suddenly the man was sitting in the booth, already facing the counter. The camera never showed him entering the building, and that part bothered me more than anything else, because the video proved something I still can't explain. The moment I heard the chair scrape, he was already inside. I had been working evenings at that store for about 8 months when this happened. It was a small gas station outside Tulsa, the kind of place that sits along a 2-lane highway with nothing but fields and scattered houses around it. During the day, it stayed busy because people heading in and out of town used it as a stop. At night, it slowed down so much that sometimes 10 or 15 minutes would pass without a single car pulling into the lot. That February night in 2024 had been one of the slower ones. Cold weather tends to keep people at home, and by the time the clock on the register showed 11:30 p.m., the store had been empty for a while. My shift ended at midnight. Closing the store followed the same routine every night. Count the cigarettes behind the counter, refill the coffee station, pull the trash from the pumps outside, start the mop bucket, and clean the floor. Around 11:45, I usually lock the doors so I can finish counting the register without customers walking in during the last few minutes. That night, I was restocking the cooler when I heard the door chime. Someone had just come in. I stepped back to the counter and saw a man walking slowly past the snack aisle. He looked like he was in his 30s, maybe early 40s. He had on a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. "Evening," I said. He didn't respond right away. He just nodded slightly and kept walking down the aisle. That wasn't unusual. Some customers barely talk at all when they come in late. I glanced at the clock behind the counter. 11:48 p.m. Still enough time for him to grab something and check out before closing. For the next couple minutes, I focused on finishing my register count while keeping an eye on him from across the store. The layout wasn't big. 4 aisles of snacks and drinks, the cooler along the back wall, and the counter at the front near the entrance. From behind the register, you could see almost every part of the store. The man walked slowly up and down the aisles. He picked up a bag of chips once, looked at it for a few seconds, then put it back. Then he moved to the drink cooler, opened it, closed it, walked away without taking anything. I cleared my throat and called out toward him. "Just so you know, we close in about 10 minutes. He looked over his shoulder and nodded again, but he kept wandering. There was something about the way he moved that made it clear he wasn't actually shopping. Most people grab what they want and head straight to the counter. He just drifted from one aisle to another, then back again. A couple minutes later, he stopped near the front door. For a second, I thought he was about to leave. Instead, he turned around and walked back toward the coolers. I glanced at the clock again. 11:55. 5 minutes until closing. I called out, trying to keep my voice polite. "We'll be closing in about 5 minutes." "Okay," he said. His voice sounded normal, calm, but he still didn't bring anything to the counter. Instead, he wandered down the last aisle again. By that point, I started feeling a little uneasy. Not scared, exactly. Just aware that he seemed to be deliberately stretching out the time he spent inside the store. I tried to focus on finishing my closing routine. The cash drawer needed to be counted and balanced before midnight. Once that was done, I could lock the door and shut off the outside lights. While I was counting bills, I heard a small click near the entrance. It was quiet, just the sound of the door lock turning. I looked up immediately. The man was standing near the front door, with his hand still resting on the handle. For a second, I assumed he was about to leave. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The lock was turned, from the inside. Our front door has a simple deadbolt that employees use when closing. Customers don't usually touch it. "Did you just lock the door?" I asked. He turned slowly and looked at me. "Yeah," he said. "Thought you were closing." My heart started beating faster. "We're about to," I said carefully, "but I need that door unlocked." He looked at the lock for a moment, then back at me. "Oh," he said. "Okay." But he didn't turn it. Instead, he stepped away from the door and walked back toward the aisles. For a second, I just stood there behind the counter. The store suddenly felt much smaller than it had a minute earlier. The man was the only customer inside, and he had just locked the only public entrance. "Sir," I said again, louder this time, "can you unlock the door, please?" He didn't respond. He had stopped near the drink cooler again and was staring at the shelves. I moved slightly closer to the phone under the counter. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to unlock that door." He turned toward me again. Then he smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one. "Relax," he said. "I will," I replied, "once the door's unlocked." For a few seconds, he stood there looking at me. Then he walked slowly back toward the entrance. I watched his hands carefully as he reached for the lock. The metal turned with another small click. He pulled the door open a few inches. Cold air drifted into the store. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He stepped outside without buying anything. Through the glass, I watched him walk across the parking lot toward a dark sedan parked near the pumps. He got into the driver's seat and started the engine. Then the car pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the highway. For a moment, I stayed behind the counter without moving. The store was completely silent again. Finally, I walked to the door and locked it myself. This time, I left the key turned in the deadbolt until the end of my shift. After that night, I noticed something about the lock that had never crossed my mind before. Customers could reach it just as easily as employees. And for a few minutes that night, the only person controlling whether the door stayed open or closed had been the man wandering the aisles. Closing a diner usually feels like the safest part of the shift. By the time you get to the end of the night, the rush is gone, the loud customers are gone, and everything starts narrowing down into simple tasks. Refill the creamers, wipe the menus, stack the mugs, count the register, sweep the floor. The place gets quieter with every step, and most nights that quiet feels earned. That was how I always thought about it when I worked late shifts in Fresno. I was 22 at the time, and the diner was the first job I had had where I felt like I actually knew what I was doing. It wasn't a fancy place. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, bright overhead lights that made everyone look a little tired after 10 at night. But I liked it. The regulars were predictable, the other servers were easy to work with, and after a few months I knew the whole rhythm of the building. You learn those rhythms fast in a diner. You know what the kitchen sounds like when the grill is cooling down. You know how long the dishwasher takes to finish a cycle. You know how the room changes when a table is almost ready to leave. People stop looking at the menu. They lean back, they start checking phones, they ask for the bill in a different tone than when they ask for coffee. Once you work enough closing shifts, you also know the usual ways customers linger. Some sit too long because they're talking. Some don't notice the time. Some want one more refill and then another. It can be annoying, but it's normal. You don't assume anything dark from a person sitting in a booth after the dinner crowd is gone. That's part of why I didn't react fast enough with him. This happened in May of 2023. It was a Thursday night, which usually meant the diner got busy around dinner and then thinned out pretty steadily after 9. By 11, you were mostly looking at a few late workers, maybe someone coming from a game or a shift at the hospital, and the occasional person who just didn't want to go home yet. I had clocked in earlier that afternoon and was scheduled through close. There were 3 of us on the floor at the start of the night, plus the cook, a dishwasher, and the assistant manager in the office doing paperwork. Nothing about the shift felt off. If anything, it was easier than usual. People came in, ate, paid, and left without much trouble. The man came in a little after 10:30. He was alone and looked like someone you could easily miss if you weren't paying attention. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark button-up shirt, jeans, clean enough that he didn't stand out as rough or out of place. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't loud. He didn't walk in with the kind of energy that makes you brace yourself. He just stood at the entrance for a second looking around, then slid into a booth near the far side of the dining room. I grabbed a menu and walked over. "Evening," I said. "Just you?" He smiled a little and said, "Yeah." His voice was normal. Friendly, even. I handed him the menu, got his drink order, and moved on. At first, he seemed like any other late customer. He ordered a burger, fries, and coffee. Nothing unusual. When I brought the food out, he thanked me. When I came back to check on him a few minutes later, he said everything was good. The first thing I noticed was that he ate slowly. That's not suspicious by itself. Plenty of people do. But by the time the other last few tables had paid out and left, he was still sitting with half his fries left, drinking coffee and looking around the room more than he looked at his plate. Still, he wasn't a problem customer. At around 11:20, my coworker Marissa finished her side work and told me she was heading out. That was normal. We staggered people out as the diner emptied, and whoever still had a table stayed a little longer. I remember saying something like, "I've just got booth 6, meaning him, and she nodded and left through the back after cashing out. That left me and one other server, Elena, on the floor. The man kept sitting there. By 11:40, his plate was mostly empty, but he still had coffee and hadn't asked for the check. I walked over and said, in my usual customer service tone, "Can I get you anything else tonight?" He looked up at me and said, "What time do you get out of here?" The question caught me slightly off guard, mostly because of how direct it was. I smiled politely and gave the standard answer people use in service jobs when they don't want to answer that honestly. "Whenever we finish closing," I said. He nodded like that was useful information. Then he said, "You always work nights?" I laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because that's the reflex you get when a customer asks something that feels too personal and you want to keep it light. "Sometimes," I said. "Can I bring you more coffee?" "Sure." So I brought him more coffee. That was one of the choices I replayed later, not because I think refusing him would have solved anything, but because that small act extended the interaction. It kept him in the booth. It kept him with a reason to stay. At the time, though, it still felt like one of those slightly uncomfortable customer conversations you move through all the time. He asked where I was from. He asked if I was in school. He asked if I liked working there. Nothing was explicit enough to justify shutting him down hard. It was just too interested, too focused on me instead of the meal. The kind of thing that makes your shoulders tighten while your face stays polite. Around midnight, Elena came over while I was filling sugar caddies and said quietly, "Your guy's been here forever." I glanced over at his booth and said, "I know. You want me to drop the check?" she asked. "I already did," I said. And I had. He just hadn't touched it. The check sat beside his empty plate, folded under the little black bill holder the way we always leave it. He had looked at it once and left it where it was. Elena shrugged and said, "If he's still here in 10, tell him we're closing." Then she headed into the back to finish her own side work. The man was watching me again by the time I turned around. That part was starting to become consistent. Every time I looked up from what I was doing, his attention was already on me. I walked over with the coffee pot and asked, "Do you need a refill before we close out?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "How many people stay this late?" I said, "Depends on the night." He looked toward the kitchen, then back at me. "Not many tonight." It wasn't exactly a question. No, I said, pretty quiet. Then I topped off the coffee and went back behind the counter. I should say this clearly. At that point, I was uncomfortable, but I wasn't yet scared in the way people think of fear. I wasn't thinking I'm in immediate danger. I was thinking, this guy is weird, and I want him gone. That gap matters. It's where a lot of these situations live. A person can make you uneasy for a long time before there's a clean moment where you can say, now it has changed. At 12:10, Elena left. She called out, "Night," from the back hallway, and I answered without turning around because I was restocking straws at the counter. When I did turn around, the dining room felt larger. That happens in empty restaurants. Every occupied booth matters. One person sitting quietly in a nearly empty room changes how the whole place feels. The assistant manager had already left through the office side door, maybe 15 minutes earlier after finishing paperwork. The cook was still in the kitchen, but our cook at night mostly kept to himself. And once the orders stop coming in, he shifts into cleanup mode and isn't paying attention to the floor unless you call for him. So it was basically me in the front and him in the booth. I walked over with the check in my hand this time instead of leaving it on the table. "We're closed," I said. "I need to cash this out whenever you're ready." He looked at the bill, then at me, and smiled. Not a broad grin, just a small, controlled smile. "I'm waiting until everyone else leaves," he said. That was the moment everything in my body changed. Not because he raised his voice or stood up or threatened me. The opposite, really. He said it like he was stating a preference. Calm, patient, like there was no need to hide what he meant anymore. For a second, I just stared at him. Then I said, "The kitchen's still open. You need to pay and head out." He kept the same expression. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. I remember feeling my face stay neutral while the rest of me pulled inward. That automatic server mode where your mouth keeps sounding normal because you haven't decided yet what normal is going to cost you. I stepped back from the table and said, "I'll be right back." Then I walked to the kitchen. The cook, Luis, was scraping the grill when I got there. He looked up and must have seen something in my face because he said, "What?" I said, "The guy at booth 6 won't leave." Luis shrugged in that tired late shift way and said, "Tell him we're closed." I did. What'd he say? I hesitated for maybe half a second because saying it out loud made it real in a way I didn't want. He said he's waiting until everyone else leaves. Luis set the scraper down. He looked past me toward the pass-through window that faced the dining room. From the kitchen, you couldn't see the booth directly unless you leaned. "Is anyone else out there?" he asked. "No." He wiped his hands on a towel and stepped closer to the window. Then he leaned enough to get a look and straightened back up. "He's still sitting?" "Yeah." Luis was not a dramatic person. He was in his 50s, had worked in kitchens forever, and treated most problems like they were annoyances instead of emergencies. That was part of why what he did next mattered. He said, "Don't go back out there by yourself." I felt some of the pressure in my chest shift when he said that, because up until then I had still been trying to decide whether I was overreacting. He reached for the phone on the wall by the prep station and asked, "You want me to call the manager or cops?" I said, "Can you come out first?" He nodded. We walked out together. The man was still in the booth exactly where I left him. He had both hands around the coffee mug now. The check was still untouched on the table. Luis stopped a few feet from the booth and said, not rude but not soft either, "We're closed. You need to pay and leave." The man looked at Luis, then at me, and the smile faded. For the first time, he seemed irritated. "I haven't finished my coffee," he said. Luis said, "Then finish paying too." There was a silence after that where nobody moved. Then the man reached slowly into his pocket, pulled out a wallet, and set cash on the table. Enough to cover the meal and then some. He stood up, not fast, just enough to make the booth seat push back against the wall with a small squeak. He looked at me directly when he said the next part, "You shouldn't be here by yourself this late." Then he walked toward the door. Luis stayed where he was until the man reached it, unlocked it, and stepped out. We both watched him cross the parking lot. He didn't have a car parked right in front. He kept walking past the first few empty spaces and disappeared into the darker section beyond the side of the building where employee cars were parked. Luis turned to me and said, "Call your manager." So I did. By the time the manager answered, my hands were working fine again, but I could hear in my own voice that something had shifted. I told her what happened as directly as I could. Her response was immediate. "Lock the doors. Don't go out alone. I'm coming back." She lived maybe 15 minutes away and returned faster than that. During the time we waited, Luis stayed in the front with me. He turned on a couple extra lights and stood near the counter pretending to finish paperwork while really just keeping watch on the windows. I busied myself with things that didn't need to be done yet because doing nothing felt worse. The cash he left was still on the table and neither of us touched it. When the manager got there, she asked for a description and wanted to know exactly what he said, in what order, whether he touched me, whether he threatened me, whether he was still in the lot. I kept saying no, he just stayed. He just kept staying. That was what made it hard to explain cleanly. He didn't lunge, he didn't yell, he just waited until the room emptied enough to tell me what he was doing. We called the police non-emergency line after that. An officer came, took the description, and asked all the usual questions. The answer to most of them made me feel ridiculous, even though I knew it shouldn't. Did he threaten you directly? No. Did he refuse to pay? No. Did he damage anything? No. Did he say he intended to harm you? Not in those words. What he did was worse in a quieter way. He used normal diner time against me. He sat there long enough for everyone else to leave naturally, and then told me he had noticed. I finished the shift only because by then there were 3 of us in the building, and the sky was already starting to pale at the edges. I did not walk to my car alone that morning. After that, the diner changed closing procedures for a while. No server stayed in the front alone during the last half hour. The manager or cook made sure they were visible. We locked earlier on slower nights. None of that felt dramatic from the outside. It just felt like common sense once the illusion of harmless lingering was gone. I kept working there for several more months. Most nights were normal. Most customers were normal. But after that, whenever someone stayed too long after closing, I noticed the room changing sooner. I noticed who else was still there. I noticed where the exits were, which lights were on, whether anyone was lingering near the door instead of the register. And on quiet nights, when the dining room emptied down to one occupied booth, I stopped thinking of that as the easiest part of the shift. Overnight warehouse work gets quiet in a way that makes small sounds matter more than they should. During the day, a warehouse is constant noise. Forklifts moving, pallet jacks rattling, dock doors opening and slamming shut, people calling to each other from one aisle to the next. After a while, your brain filters most of it out because there's too much coming at you all at once. At night, it's different. The building never becomes silent exactly, but the noise drops down to a level where you can tell what belongs and what doesn't. You hear the HVAC cycle on. You hear a dock plate settle. You hear plastic wrap shifting somewhere under a vent, and know it's only plastic wrap because the sound is too light to be anything else. When you've worked enough overnight shifts, those differences become part of how you move through the building. You trust routine because routine is what lets you manage a large space with only a few people on the clock. That's why it took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to accept that someone was inside that warehouse with us. This happened in Indianapolis in April of 2022. I was 37 then, working as an overnight warehouse supervisor for a distribution company that handled a mix of packaged goods and commercial inventory. The building itself was huge but simple in layout. Loading docks along one end, receiving on the opposite side, long rows of high metal racking in between, and a few caged storage sections that stayed locked except during certain shifts. Most nights, my job wasn't dramatic. I handled paperwork, monitored loading schedules, checked incoming and outgoing inventory, and made sure the smaller overnight crew stayed on track. We usually had enough people in the building to keep things moving, but not enough that someone could wander the whole floor without eventually ending up alone in an aisle. That's important because people hear warehouse and imagine an empty cavern. Ours wasn't empty, it was just spread out. You could be 100 feet from another person and still feel like you were by yourself if you were in the wrong section. The shift started normally that night. We had 2 outbound trailers scheduled before dawn, and I spent the first few hours doing what I always did, checking manifests, coordinating with the forklift operators, answering routine questions, and making sure the staging lanes near the dock stayed clear. Around midnight, the main movement slowed down. The truck departures were on time, and the floor settled into the quieter part of the night where the work becomes more repetitive. That's usually when my attention gets sharper, not looser. When the building is noisy, strange sounds can hide inside all the normal activity. When it gets quiet, a single off-pattern sound has nowhere to go. At 12:43 a.m., one of the motion alarms tripped in Section D. Section D was a locked storage zone near the back third of the warehouse, nothing especially valuable compared to the rest of the inventory, but it stayed closed overnight because there was no reason for anyone on my shift to be in there. The sensor itself wasn't unusual. We had motion detectors tied into a basic internal security system so that if activity showed up in a closed zone, someone would know. The panel in my office gave a short alert tone and displayed the section number. I looked at it, waited a second, and then cleared it. My first thought was sensor drift or air movement. It happened occasionally, especially when weather changed fast outside. Metal buildings react to temperature in ways that can make sensors more sensitive than they should be. I made a note of the time in the incident log and kept working. 10 minutes later, the same section triggered again. That got my attention, not because it proved anything, but because repeated false alarms are more annoying than one-offs, and overnight annoyance becomes your problem quickly. I checked the camera feed we had covering the outside entrance to that section. The picture quality wasn't great, but it was good enough to show the locked gate and the first stretch of aisle beyond it. Nothing moved. No forklifts, no shadows crossing, no one standing by the gate. I reset the alert again. At 1:07 a.m., Section E triggered. That was adjacent to D. This was the point where it stopped feeling like random sensor behavior. Sections D and E shared a long back wall and were divided internally by racking and chain link caging. If a sensor problem moved that neatly from one zone to the next, it was either a very odd technical issue or something with a path. I got up from the office, stepped out onto the warehouse floor, and listened. The building had dropped into its low-noise state by then. One forklift operating near receiving on the far side, but it sounded distant. The dock area was quiet. The overhead lights hummed faintly. Somewhere, a pallet wrap tail fluttered against cardboard. Normal sounds. Nothing from the back sections. I walked toward D and E with my flashlight clipped to my belt more out of habit than need. The main aisle lighting was on, but those sections always felt darker because of the rack height and the way the shadows formed between pallets. As I got closer, I ran through the reasonable explanations again. A loose sensor, an HVAC draft, maybe even a stray cat if one had gotten in through a dock earlier, though that's less common than people think in facilities that size. The gate to Section D was still locked. I checked it physically. No sign of damage. No bent latch, no cut chain. Nothing that suggested someone had forced entry from the front. I stood there for a moment, looking through the mesh into the aisle beyond. Still nothing. Then I heard it. A metallic rattle, quick and specific, somewhere deeper in the section. Not loud enough to echo across the whole building, but loud enough that I knew exactly what it was not. It wasn't a settling beam. It wasn't ductwork. It sounded like something had touched metal shelving. I stayed still and listened harder. Nothing followed. One of the forklift operators, Marcus, was crossing the main aisle farther up with an empty pallet. I waved him down and told him to kill the engine for a second. He shut it off and asked, "What's up?" "Motion alarms in D and E," I said. "I just heard something in there." He glanced toward the cage and then back at me. "You want me to grab bolt cutters?" he asked, half joking. "No, just stay near this end for a minute." I keyed open the section with the supervisor key, unlatched the gate, and stepped inside. The first thing that hits you in a warehouse aisle when you're alone is how much visibility you don't really have. From the main walkway, it feels open. Once you're inside, every stacked pallet creates a blind corner. Every shrink-wrapped load reflects light in a way that can look like movement for half a second. I moved slowly. The first aisle looked normal. Boxes where they should be. Stretch wrap intact. No signs that anything had been pulled down or gone through. I turned into the next row. Same thing. The alarms in these sections weren't tied to individual shelves, just general movement zones. That meant whatever had set them off could have crossed through and then stopped long before I entered. I kept walking. About halfway down the third row, I noticed a plastic water bottle lying near the base of a pallet. That didn't belong there. It wasn't impossible for trash to show up in the warehouse. People are people. But our floor crew knew better than to leave water bottles in locked storage sections they didn't work in. Also, this one was tucked too neatly behind the edge of a pallet to be accidental. I crouched and looked closer. The bottle was half full. No dust on the cap. No grime around the base. Recently used. That didn't confirm anything by itself, but it changed my pace. I stopped looking for a glitch and started looking for signs of occupation. I continued deeper into the section, checking behind lower pallets where someone might have shoved belongings to keep them out of sight. Then I heard another sound. This one was softer, from somewhere to my right, a dull shifting noise like weight against cardboard or wood. I stopped immediately. The aisle ahead stayed still. I turned my head and listened. Nothing. Marcus called faintly from the gate area. "You good?" "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure yet. I followed the sound into a cross aisle where oversized pallets were stacked lower than usual. That made the space feel more open, but it also created a gap behind a row of wrapped product near the back wall. And behind that gap, I found the sleeping bag. It was rolled halfway open on flattened cardboard, tucked into a space someone had made between pallet stacks and the wall. Beside it sat a black backpack, an extra hoodie, 2 bottled waters, and a grocery bag with wrappers inside. Everything in that little space had been arranged with the kind of logic people use when they expect to return. Not dumped, not abandoned, organized. I just stood there looking at it for a second. A sleeping bag hidden behind pallets is not theft, it's presence. That's the moment the warehouse changed for me. Up until then, I was still dealing with alarms and noises. Standing there in front of someone's makeshift sleeping area, I had to accept that a person had been spending time in the building overnight while we worked under the assumption that only staff were inside. I backed out of the space and called Marcus over. He walked up, looked past me, and said, "Nope." That was his whole response at first, just immediate refusal of the situation. "Anybody in there?" he asked quietly. "I haven't seen anyone." He looked around instinctively then, the way people do when they realize their location just got redefined. Same racks, same pallets, different meaning. I told him, "We're not searching the rest of this ourselves." That decision came easy. I know the building well, but that was exactly why I understood how bad a solo search would be. Whoever had been sleeping there knew the blind spots too, maybe better than we did if they'd been moving through the place night after night while staying unnoticed. We exited the section, locked the gate behind us, and called security and police. While waiting, I had the rest of the overnight crew move toward the front of the building and stay in pairs. I didn't want people isolated in side aisles, pretending everything was normal because normal had already ended. I also didn't want to trigger a panic that would have workers scattering unpredictably. So I kept it simple. No one goes to the back sections alone. Stay near the dock office until we sort this out. The reactions were what you'd expect. Questions, nervous jokes, a few people trying to act like it had to be one of our own employees messing around. I didn't argue with them. I just said, "There's a sleeping setup behind pallets in D. We treat it seriously." That shut the joking down. Security arrived first. 2 guards from the contract company we used overnight. They were useful enough for access control, but I wouldn't have trusted them to sweep the entire warehouse on their own. They stayed at the section entrance until officers arrived. Once police got there, I walked them through what happened from the first motion alarm forward. The repeated triggers, the rattling shelf, the bottle, the sleeping bag, and backpack. An officer asked, "Any idea how long someone could have been staying in there?" I looked back through the gate toward the aisle. "Long enough to know our patterns," I said. That wasn't me being dramatic. It was just the truth. To sleep inside an active warehouse overnight, you'd need timing. You'd need to know when the sections went quiet, which aisles were least visible from the main floor, when people took breaks, when deliveries came and went, which doors were alarmed and which weren't. This wasn't someone who had accidentally gotten locked in and improvised for one night. The police searched the warehouse with security and one of our facility managers who had come in after my call. They checked the hidden sleeping area, photographed it, and then expanded the search through the back sections, maintenance corridors, and loading zones. They did not find the person. What they did find were more small signs once they knew what to look for. Another empty water bottle near an emergency exit that should have stayed clear. A stack of flattened boxes positioned where someone could sit behind them and still see movement across a main aisle. A side door with latchware that suggested it had been used more often than anyone thought. By the time the search was over, the working theory was that someone had been entering the warehouse after evening operations and remaining hidden through the night, possibly leaving before the morning shift fully ramped up or moving between blind areas depending on activity. I kept working there after that because people usually do keep working in places after disturbing things happen. Rent still exists, shifts still need coverage, buildings don't stop needing supervisors just because your relationship with the space changed. But the warehouse never felt the same again. Before that night, the sounds had categories: forklift, dock door, HVAC, settling rack, human voice from receiving. You could hear something and place it quickly. After that, every off-pattern noise demanded more attention. A shrink-wrap pallet crackling under airflow made me stop and listen. A shelf rattle from the back third of the building changed my route. A motion alert in a quiet section was no longer a technical nuisance. It was a question with a person attached to it. The most unsettling part wasn't the sleeping bag itself. It was how ordinary the hidden space looked once we found it. Cardboard flattened for comfort. Water, food wrappers, a backpack tucked where it wouldn't be visible unless you walked into exactly the right gap. Someone had turned that warehouse into a place to sleep while we kept calling it empty. And if the alarms hadn't repeated in a pattern that night, I don't know how much longer it would have stayed that way. An overnight job at a gas station is mostly about staying awake. That's the honest version of it. People imagine those shifts are full of strange customers and constant tension, but most of the time it's long stretches where nothing happens. Cars pass by on the highway, maybe someone pulls in for gas, maybe someone comes inside for cigarettes or a drink, but the hours between midnight and sunrise can feel like they stretch forever. I was 30 when this happened, working nights at a gas station just outside Macon, Georgia. The place sat along a rural stretch of road with woods on one side and a few scattered houses on the other. During the day, it was busy because it was one of the only stations for several miles. At night, it slowed down so much that sometimes 15 or 20 minutes would pass without a single car pulling into the lot. The building itself was small. Front counter, 2 aisles of snacks, a cooler wall along the back, and a single restroom down a short hallway near the coffee machines. If someone walked into the store, you could usually see where they went right away. That's why I noticed the man almost immediately when he came in that night. It was sometime after 1 a.m. The clock on the register said 1:12 when the door chime sounded. I looked up from the lottery tickets I was organizing and saw a man step inside. He didn't say anything when he walked in. Some customers don't. They just nod and head straight for whatever they came to buy. This guy didn't go toward the shelves or the cooler. He walked straight toward the hallway where the bathroom was. That wasn't unusual either. Truck drivers stopped there sometimes just to use the restroom before getting back on the road. The man pushed the bathroom door open and went inside. The door closed behind him. I went back to what I was doing. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. That's when I started paying attention. You get used to how long people usually spend in a gas station bathroom. A couple minutes, maybe 5 if they're washing up or changing clothes. Longer than that usually means someone is sick, using drugs, or messing around with something they shouldn't be. At 20 minutes, I walked down the hallway and knocked on the door. "Everything okay in there?" I asked. No answer. I waited a few seconds and knocked again. Still nothing. That didn't automatically mean something bad had happened. Sometimes people fall asleep in there, especially if they're coming off long drives. Sometimes they put headphones in and don't hear you. I went back to the counter and kept working. Another 10 minutes went by. The bathroom door stayed closed. No flush, no sink running, no movement. At that point, it had been almost half an hour. I walked down the hallway again and knocked harder this time. "Hey," I said through the door. "You all right in there?" Nothing. I leaned closer and listened. The bathroom was small enough that if someone moved inside, you'd hear it. Shoes shifting, clothing, rustling, something. But it sounded completely quiet. That's the part that started bothering me. If someone had passed out or gotten sick, you'd expect some kind of noise. Instead, there was nothing at all. I went back to the counter and checked the front windows. The parking lot was empty. No cars at the pumps. No headlights coming down the road. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights inside the store and the faint buzz of the soda machines. For a moment, I thought about calling the non-emergency police line, but then I hesitated. If the guy was just sitting in there using his phone, calling the cops would feel like overreacting. So I waited. Another 15 minutes passed. By then, the clock read almost 2 a.m. The bathroom door had been closed for nearly an hour. I walked down the hallway again. This time I knocked as hard as I could. "Sir," I said loudly, "you need to answer me or I'm opening the door." Still nothing. I tried the handle. Locked. That was normal. Most people lock the door when they use it, but after almost an hour of silence, it felt different. I stood there debating what to do next when I heard something inside. A small movement, like someone shifting their weight. Then the lock clicked. The door opened slowly. The man stepped out. He looked exactly the same as when he walked in. Same jacket, same calm expression. No sign that anything unusual had happened inside. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded once. "Yeah." His voice sounded normal. No slurring, no panic, nothing. He walked past me toward the front of the store. I followed a few steps behind him. "Everything okay in there?" I asked again. "Fine," he said. Then he pushed the front door open and walked outside. I watched him cross the parking lot. He didn't go to a car. He kept walking down the road until the darkness swallowed him up beyond the streetlight. For a moment, I just stood there inside the doorway. Then I turned around and walked back toward the bathroom. The light was still on. The sink was dry. The toilet lid was down. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I noticed something behind the toilet tank. A black backpack. It was wedged between the tank and the wall where you wouldn't see it unless you stepped all the way inside. I stared at it for a few seconds before touching it. The bag wasn't zipped all the way. I pulled the zipper open just enough to see inside. The first thing I saw was a roll of duct tape. Under that was a bundle of white zip ties. Several of them, the kind used for tying cables together. My stomach felt tight in a way that's hard to explain. Those things by themselves aren't illegal. People carry tools in backpacks all the time. But finding them hidden behind a toilet tank in a gas station bathroom after a guy spent nearly an hour inside without making a sound changed how they felt. I closed the zipper and stepped back. Then I locked the front door. For the rest of the shift, I stayed behind the counter with the phone nearby. I called my manager and explained what I'd found. He told me not to touch the bag again and said he'd call the police. 2 officers came out around 3 a.m. They took the backpack and asked me to describe the man who had left it. Height, clothes, hair, which direction he walked. I answered everything I could remember, but the truth was, there wasn't much to go on. He hadn't bought anything. He hadn't argued. He hadn't even stayed long enough after leaving the bathroom to draw attention. He had just walked out. Before the officers left, one of them asked me something that stuck with me afterward. "Did he look like he forgot the bag?" he said. I thought about that for a moment. The man had been in that bathroom for nearly an hour. The bag had been hidden carefully behind the toilet tank. And when he walked out, he never once looked back toward the hallway. "No," I said. "He didn't look like he forgot it." If these stories reminded you how unsettling it can be to work alone at night, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and tell me which story stayed with you the longest. But night shifts aren't the only time people end up alone in unfamiliar places. Click now to watch 4 disturbing Airbnb horror stories, because sometimes the scariest place to sleep is a house that doesn't really belong to you. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.